Jim the Ape Want Proof. Hello again, humans. It is I, Jim the Ape, and this is my monthly video. I'm kidding, of course. I only wish my content output was that frequent and consistent. But instead of wasting several minutes talking your ears off about why that's the case, I'll just say that I've been thinking about rebranding this channel in the somewhat near future. I want to move away from the more political type of content I'm used to making and start making a lot more entertainment-based videos. And I was also thinking I might start appearing on camera and speaking off the top of my head instead of scripting, although I pretty much just write how I talk anyway. But those plans will have to wait, because as soon as I saw this pseudo-animated political propaganda video I'm about to show you, I knew I had to make a response video to it, regardless of how many other YouTubers had already done so, including Chris Raygun, who is almost as bad as me when it comes to content output. It may very well be an entry in the Dead Horse series, but I have a lot to say about this video, and I'm probably going to get pretty pissed off at points, so without any further ado, let's get started.
There you are, playing the PvP in your World War II shooter, and all of a sudden, you're a Nazi. You didn't ask for this. You didn't choose this. Yet there it is.
10 seconds. That is all it took for you to say something not only factually incorrect, but also patently absurd. And oddly enough, if you had taken the same amount of time to think about what you said before saying it, you probably would have held your tongue. In case you don't know what I mean, let me spell it out for you. You bought the fucking game! I know it's a hard concept for a smooth brain such as yourself, but video games are optional. You can't claim that anything that happens in a game you play was forced upon you. Granted, you may run into something that surprises you in a game that wasn't in the marketing, but you could have also done research about the game before buying it using various online resources, including Let's Plays on YouTube, where people literally play the entirety of the game right before your eyes. And even if you do run into something you didn't expect and don't like in a video game, despite all of the information about it that is made available to you, you are under no obligation whatsoever to continue playing said game. You can turn it off, go resell it, or throw it in the fucking trash if you want to. So there is no excuse for not knowing about a game that lets you play as a fictional version of the Nazis before you play it, or acting like it's not your fault if you blindly go into a World War II game and find out that that's the case. You did ask for it, you did choose it, and you can choose at any time to stop playing the game.
And it's treated no differently than playing a British soldier.
Look, I'm no big fan of the UK either, but I'm not about to go comparing them to Nazis. And need I remind you that it's player versus player in a World War II shooter game? Because that combination of concepts necessitates that someone has to play as the Nazis. When you were a kid, did you go to play cops and robbers and every kid just played a cop? Did you play cowboys and Indians and every kid just wanted to be a cowboy because otherwise it would be cultural appropriation? No, because when you're role-playing in a fictional scenario that contains conflict, you can't all be the same side or else there's no conflict. I really should not have to explain this concept to an adult. I'm not even joking when I say that. You should have grasped this concept in your first 5 or 6 years of life on Earth. Good God, that's an annoying intro at full volume. Somebody get me a bottle of aspirin and some earplugs, please.
This is bad on so many levels.
I agree. This video is retarded and you haven't even gotten started yet.
No one should ever have a random chance of fighting for the Nazis.
Military-aged German men did in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Oh right, I forgot. You're talking about people sitting in the comfort of their own homes, playing completely optional video games for recreation, and having the random chance in said games of playing for a team of fictional Nazis made entirely out of pixels. When I put it that way, it almost sounds like you're complaining about the absolute pinnacle of non-existent first world problems.
And we should never express that there's no meaningful difference between Nazis and Allied soldiers, or that they're functionally interchangeable.
Who said that? Who the fuck said that?
Seriously, find me one person who genuinely believes that in real life there was no difference between the Nazis and the Allies so that I can chastise them for being as dropped on head as a fetus retarded as you are. The only way in which you can even argue that anyone is treating those two factions as functionally interchangeable is because you're talking about a fucking video game where the fictional representations of Nazis function similar to the Allied soldiers because it's a player versus player combat simulation set in World War II. What do you expect game developers to do? Do you want them to create two entirely different sets of gameplay mechanics so that when players control the Nazis, they're constantly being beaten over the head about how evil the Nazis were?
And before anyone equivocates and says not all German soldiers in World War II were Nazis,
That's not an equivocation, that's an objective fact. I think Tealdeer explained it better than I could in his response video to this same video, but basically there were like 3 or 4 different military branches in Germany at the time, and pretty much only 1 or maybe 2 of them were established by Hitler to be his own forces. The rest were just pre-existing military that fell under his control when he became the German head of state. I mean, think about it. Do you call all US soldiers in today's military Trump supporters? No, because many of them disagree with the president politically, but are still under his command due to the country's power structure. Much in the same way, many German soldiers at the time were forced to act on Hitler's behalf, even if they hated everything he stood for. Not to mention the mob mentality on steroids and extreme societal pressure that I somehow ended up mentioning in my previous video about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Point is, painting all World War II era German soldiers as Nazis is not only factually wrong, it's also very simple-minded and kinda fucking bigoted.
if they were wearing the swastika and are functioning as an arm of the Nazi government, then unless the game goes out of its way to tell you specifically that your particular character is not a Nazi, then they're a Nazi.
Yeah, great plan. I love it when video games stop dead in their tracks to morally coddle me and tell me I'm not one of the bad guys. Seriously, this mentality pisses me off because if you follow it through to its logical conclusion, then it forbids the very existence of any video games where you play as anyone with questionable morality. All those Grand Theft Auto titles and similar game franchises where you play as criminals, you can't do that anymore unless there's a big text scroll at the start telling you, it's okay, you're not really a ruthless gangster, you're an undercover cop or something, so go crack some skulls. And it's insulting to me because what medium could be better suited for role-playing as a villain than in video games? It's interactive, often cinematic in presentation, and the best part is that none of the harm done by a playable bad guy is done to actual real-life human beings. It's all fictional and made of pixels. So no, I don't think a game should go out of its way to hold your hand and stroke your head and say, it's okay, little one, you're one of the good guys. If anything, I think you should grow the fuck up and learn to handle the fact that in a fantasy setting, some people are okay with or even enjoy being the bad guy.
In that multiplayer shooter, when it switched you to the German side, did it go out of its way to tell you that the person you're playing was pressed into service under threat of their life?
No, because that would be annoying as fuck and it would kill the pacing dead in its tracks. Not to mention the fact that, unlike you, most gamers are competent adults with functioning brains who can separate fantasy from reality and therefore probably don't give a fuck if they're playing as a Nazi by choice or a Nazi by conscription. I know this is a hard concept for you, but maybe, just maybe, the only thing they truly desire is to play the fucking game! Now, through the power of video editing, answer me this. Did you even think about any of this before you shat out this dumpster fire of a video?
That's a big ol' nope.
That's what I thought.
Oh, and on a similar note, let's please stop forcing people to play as terrorists as well.
Again, nobody is forcing you. Video games are optional. In fact, I'm going to skip a section of this video because he basically just repeats the first minute of ill-informed complaining, but instead of World War II shooters, it's modern shooters, and instead of Nazis, it's terrorists. So if you want to, you can just start this video over and replace all those relevant words in your mind. But since I, unlike this guy, don't assume that my my audience is a mindless coagulation of brain-dead amoebas, I'll just assume that you can imagine what that would be like, and we can just move on.
Even if you put aside all of the people who have had traumatic experiences with these groups, who have lost loved ones to terrorists, or who have had generations of their families wiped out by Nazis,
I would tell them the exact same thing I'm telling you, albeit with a bit more sympathy towards them. Because at the end of the day, we are still talking about fictional representations of real-life events being played out in a fantasy world made entirely out of lines of code. It is tragic what those people went through, but the terrorists in the modern shooters are not the real terrorists that killed their loved ones, and the Nazis in the World War II shooters are not the real Nazis that wiped out their families. They need to learn to separate fantasy from reality just as much as you do. Most of them already can, and they have my respect for that. The only difference is that you have no excuse to see these games as anything other than the fictional works of art that they are.
no one should have to put on the costume of an ideology they find abhorrent without actually opting into it in your game.
You opt into it when you buy the fucking game, retard! Also, it's uniform, not costume. Pedantic, I know, but military units aren't playing dress up for Halloween.
And by making people do so, we get them to stop thinking about it, to stop thinking of the meaning behind these things.
Yeah, because God forbid people get the chance to relax and turn their brains off for a couple of hours while playing a fucking video game. Oh, the horror!
We normalize them.
Did you hear that? Normalize. Anyone playing buzzword bingo at home, mark that one off on your cards.
We make them just window dressing for entertainment.
What the fuck does that even mean? Is that just some pretentious pseudo-philosophical way of saying that certain things can't be used in game design because games are fun and you're too mentally immature to know the difference between a fun fantasy and a harsh reality? Because now that I think about it, that sounds like it's exactly what you're trying to say.
Those uniforms, those symbols, become things that no longer inherently revolt us. They reduce our visceral reaction to seeing the embodiment of these ideologies.
Good. Humans place way too much value on symbols as it is. Not to mention, it's better to be able to think about these things rationally rather than throwing a fit every time you see the wrong combination of shapes and colors. Of course, I would never presume to tell you that you can't have an emotional reaction, as that's well within your right to free expression. I'm just saying that it's ideal to be able to temper that reaction with logic and reason, because not everything that you viscerally dislike is something that's maliciously out to get you and cause destruction in the world. Sometimes a game is just a game.
Now, does this make us totally ignore the history that comes with them? No.
Congratulations, you got one teeny tiny little thing right in this vast sea of stupidity.
But for some people, it moves them from the territory of revolting to just edgy.
And perish the thought that anyone could get the slightest semblance of joy out of pushing the boundaries of what society deems acceptable. What kind of evil, twisted savages would dare revel in saying the magic words that make pearl-clutching moral crusaders faint from shock? Those dastardly fiends are destroying our way of life, fucking edge fags.
It makes scrawling a swastika on something change from unthinkable to just dangerous.
What the fuck do you got against Buddhists, you fucking racist?
It means you might not take iron crosses all over a website as a warning sign that you should immediately leave. And if you don't leave, you might start reading and buying into hateful ideas there.
Oh boy. Look, I'm probably going to piss some people off with what I'm about to say, but since when have I ever given a shit about that? Anyway, if you go to, say, Stormfront, since I think that's the website you're trying to refer to in this part of your video, and you go there and you read their bullshit articles, and by simply being exposed to that misinformation, you absorb it and start believing it, you're so far beyond any semblance of human mental capacity that to call you retarded would be far more of an insult to people with legitimate learning disabilities, and actually far more of a compliment to you than you would hypothetically deserve in that scenario. Granted, I don't go on Stormfront or any other such website because, quite frankly, I have much better things to do with what little free time that I have, but if I had to for some reason, I am very confident that I would either rage at their ignorant hatred or laugh at their stupidity, the latter of which I'm currently doing to you. Possibly both at the same time. That's the beauty of being a mentally competent adult adult with a functioning brain. You can be exposed to ideas and refute them either in your own mind or verbally aloud to yourself, and therefore not every idea you are exposed to becomes an idea that you believe and start espousing yourself. But if you don't have that ability, which you seem to be implying that at least your audience and possibly you yourself don't, then I'd recommend you stay the fuck off the internet and especially social media.
It seems like such a small and simple thing.
Your brain? I know, right?
But it's things like this that erode our safeguards against dangers we sacrifice so much to fight.
Oh yeah? And when was the last time you sacrificed a goddamn thing to help anybody but your fucking self?
By the time you've played 100 hours of being a Nazi, their voice stabs become memes and in-jokes with your friends. By the 1,000th time you've respawned as a terrorist, you're either celebrating them or making fun of them.
Pretty much no one celebrates terrorists or Nazis unironically just because they played as them in a video game. Even in the extremely unlikely event that someone does, they were probably a lost cause anyway in terms of mental stability. And who would dare make fun of terrorists and Nazis, am I right? It's not as though stand-up comedians with ventriloquism skills can take a Halloween prop, put a beard and a turban on it, and make a wildly successful character out of it.
Silence! I kill you!
Oh, but thankfully, if you do make fun of Nazis in the UK, you can get arrested, charged with being grossly offensive, fined $800, and if you refuse to pay it, you could go to jail. At least one country in the world isn't an uncivilized human rights nightmare.
Neither of which helps the global crisis we have that takes thousands of lives every year.
Okay, I think you're talking about terrorism there because that makes the most sense, but it's a little unclear seeing as how a majority of this video is complaining about World War II games that let you play as Nazis. Unless you're merely visiting the current year in a time machine from 1942 or something. But the funny thing is, with your vague wording, it could be about literally anything. And if I'm right and it is about terrorism, I doubt you would go after the source material, if you know what I mean.
So what do we do?
Considering that you're still just complaining about the content of video games, either grow up and learn to separate fantasy from reality, or if that's too much to ask of you, then just don't play games that have content in them that might offend your obviously extremely delicate sensibilities. Maybe you should just stick to games rated E for everyone by the ESRB.
That's easy. Don't make them morally equivalent.
I don't think anyone thinks that they are morally equivalent. However, in a video game, they may be equivalent in terms of gameplay. Big difference.
Don't make there be no in-game moral difference between your Nazis and your allies, between your terrorists and your counter-terrorist squads.
And who the fuck are you to tell game developers what they can, and more often with you, cannot do in the works of interactive entertainment art that they make? I mean, for me personally, creative freedom and consumer choice are way more important than the idea that games need to sacrifice fun gameplay mechanics and interesting stories to instead be constantly making moral pronouncements about historical events that pretty much everyone is in agreement on anyway, at least when it comes to real-life history. But you're blurring the lines between real-life historical Nazis and fictionalized representations of them in a fantasy world where the consequences of their actions do not affect real people. Again, I should not have to explain this to an adult.
Frame PvP as a training exercise.
It fucking is a training exercise because it's a fucking video game, you worthless, brainless, spineless piece of amorphous toxic waste.
Or simply take one of your non-odious sides and recolor them so that it's red versus blue.
Yeah, and red versus blue can never even be interpreted as political. Regardless, I think we're making progress here. You don't see red versus blue as being a problem because it's vague enough to not directly connect to any ideas that hurt your fragile psyche. In that case, I have a recommendation for you. Play Halo. Play nothing but Halo online multiplayer on team matchmaking because that is red versus blue, just like you like it, and the armored space marines look nothing like like any real-life soldiers from wars past. Meanwhile, adults with functioning brains who can separate reality from fantasy, such as myself, will be playing games that let you play as bad guys and or feature Nazis or terrorists. I generally recommend the Wolfenstein games, but I hear the new one isn't that good. I guess I won't know until I play it.
Rather than Axis versus Allies.
In other words, you're not allowed to make World War II games because I'm a spineless pussy who can't handle images of certain symbols on a screen.
A good example of a game that does this is Rainbow Six Siege.
I played a little bit of that one once. It was meh.
All of your bomb diffusion and hostage rescue multiplayer with no normalizing terrorists.
Are you just saying that because you can't play as the terrorists in that game?
In fact, by having all of the characters as counter-terrorists, training for a possible threat, it highlights how real and present of a threat that is.
So in other words, yes, Jim, that is the only reason why I'm praising this good guys only game and condemning the you might play as the bad guys at some point games. And Nazis aren't a real and present threat because they were defeated in 1945 and most of them are dead now. I know your side of the political dog and pony show tends to throw around the word Nazi and basically call anyone who disagrees with you that, but no one, and I mean no one in the modern day, even if there are some who have ideological similarities, not a single person that you call a Nazi today has done anything even in the ballpark of what the actual Nazis did in the Holocaust. Now, that may be in large part due to the fact that they haven't got the power to do it, and I personally doubt that they ever will again. But I also suspect that even those rare people who love and support everything that Hitler stood for understand that it didn't end well for him, and it wouldn't end well for them if they tried the same thing.
And if you decide that you need to have both sides be playable, don't make them interchangeable.
The only reason they would be interchangeable is in terms of gameplay mechanics. In most war games I've played, the two sides may have different weapons, but it's not like the controls are suddenly going to change when you switch sides. And besides that, most people understand that the two sides are not morally the same. Although I think you tend to do a little bit too much demonizing of Nazis and to a lesser extent terrorists, because it's easier for you than it would be to critically analyze these things and examine the motivations behind the evil side. Not that doing so would justify or excuse their actions, as it most certainly does not, but it is healthy to at least try to understand how something so extreme came about and what could be done to prevent more of it in the future. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure the Nazis and the terrorists both thought that they were the good guys and that we were the bad guys from their perspective.
Don't have players randomly spawn in as one or the other.
You clearly don't know how online matchmaking works if you're saying that shit.
Allow players to choose which side they're on.
I'm not against that, but I'm also not against game developers designing their games however the fuck they want to. So if one wants to do it the other way and make it random, that's okay too. Like I said, you can have all of the information about a game made available to you within days of its release, and if you see or read something about it that you don't like, you're under no obligation to fucking buy it.
Now, of course, this has all sorts of in-game problems.
Which is why most games don't do it. It's faster and easier to just have it be randomized.
Such as creating shorter wait times for fascists.
Jesus, butt-fucking, cocksucking Christ! Not everyone who would choose to play as a Nazi in a video game is a fucking fascist! And this is real, Rich, coming from a guy whose video is at least 99% you telling game developers what they're not allowed to put in their game. Who's the fucking fascist again?
But you know what? Those wait times could be artificially extended.
Fuck you. Seriously, fuck you to an eternity of loading screen hell for even suggesting that. I genuinely hope that from now until you die, every game you try to play gets stuck on a loading screen forever and refuses to function. And then after you die, your consciousness is transported to a dimension of infinite loading screens where the presence of actual gameplay has completely forsaken you. Abandon all fun, ye who enter here, should be scrawled across the gates in the blood of the wicked souls like yourself who have been condemned there for an eternity. And in fact, those very same words should be the tagline for your YouTube channel.
if it meant players had an active choice in what teams they would represent, if you're saying we need people playing Nazis in our games.
The players themselves don't actually represent the Nazis, dickhead. They're just playing as fictional characters who are digital representations of them. It's just a fucking game after all. And it's not that games need to have playable Nazis necessarily, but it is a nice option to have for players who, and I feel I'm being repetitive myself here, are adults with functioning brains who can separate fantasy from reality. Also, it's good for gamers who also really like history and or World War II history in particular.
And if you're going to say, but we need it for historical reasons, then your game better actually be historical.
Nope. Game developers are under no obligation to make historically accurate games for you or for anyone else. I mean, I don't think Battlefield 5 was historically accurate, and you don't seem to be complaining about that one, but I don't give a shit about historical accuracy either. Remember how I mentioned the Wolfenstein games before? Well, they're not only not historically accurate, but the very premise is basically, what if the Nazis won the war and conquered the world, and there was only a small resistance movement hiding in a secret base, and their only hope to stop the oppressive regime was one badass Jewish soldier. And in case you can't tell, I generally like the Wolfenstein games, and they're very Nazi heavy because the Nazis are the villains that you fight in that game. But if there was a multiplayer mode that lets you play as Nazis, and there might be and I wouldn't know it because I never play multiplayer, I would be okay with that because well, you already know the drill by now.
If that were the case, you need your PvP to at least represent real historical events and be a realistic take on those battles.
No, they don't. What the fuck is wrong with you, dude? Have you not grasped the concept of historical fiction or what-if stories or fucking intentionally inaccurate flights of fancy that are only very loosely based on one real thing?
Once you make both sides balanced, it's also no longer historical.
Yeah, in the entire history of human civilization, there has never once been a war that wasn't a completely one-sided domination of one side over another. No two armies have ever been even close to evenly matched in terms of armaments and skills. Come on, game developers, get with the program.
And you can't really say that you need Nazis anymore for historical accuracy.
You don't need Nazis in a World War II game if it's not realistic enough, according to this smooth-brained autistic fucking retard. I seriously lack the words in the English language that are powerful enough to accurately describe and emphasize the severity of your stupidity. It is not merely a lack of information, it is actively the polar opposite. You are not simply unintelligent. You are so stupid that you have an estimated IQ in the negative 200s. You are quite literally an anti-genius.
Oh, and once you let players get cool weapons that weren't actually at that particular battleground, it's also no longer historically accurate.
Did you hear that, Bethesda? It seems that Wolfenstein Doom crossover that you've probably been planning ever since Fallout 76 tanked, you know, the one that lets players rip and tear through Nazis as the Doomslayer with the BFG 9000, well, apparently it's canceled now because this fucking pretentious douchebag says it's not historically accurate. Now, I kid about that game being planned, but I want you guys in my audience to think about how awesome that game would be if it existed, and realize how much you would hate this extra credits asshole if he was the one and only reason it wasn't going to happen. Let that sink in.
And you can't declare that your game will suffer if you don't put players in the jackboots of the Third Reich.
It will if it's a PvP shooter set in World War II. Again, if you can't see how those concepts put together necessitate playable Nazis, there is no hope for humanity.
And once your map is something carefully designed to have good gameplay by a team in a room in San Francisco or LA, and it's not a faithful reconstruction of the actual places the historical events occurred in, you can no longer say we need to have players take up arms in service of terror or hate.
All joking aside, I legitimately had some kind of mental breakdown the first time I heard that sentence in its entirety. I screamed at my laptop at the top of my lungs because of how mind-bogglingly insane what you're saying there is. Let me attempt to break it down calmly so that hopefully anyone can understand my reaction. You're basically saying that any game that has something to do with anything real or historical, such as Nazis or terrorists, has to be 100% accurate in every detail, down to the most microscopic pixel, regardless of any considerations made for fun gameplay. And if there is even a hair out of place on Hitler's toothbrush mustache, the entire game is invalid and not allowed to have Nazis or terrorists in it, or at least not playable ones. All I can say to that is the day that the entire gaming industry decides or is forced to act as though historical accuracy is the only thing that matters, and that making games that are actually fun to play doesn't matter at all, is the day that I stop calling myself a gamer.
And look, we're not saying we can't have games about World War II or about terrorism.
That basically is what you just said! At the very least, you're saying the only ones that you think should be allowed to exist are ones that are historically accurate down to the gnat's ass, and also probably ones that beat you over the head with a 2x4 with the words "Nazis are bad" written on it.
We're not even saying we shouldn't make games where you play as a Nazi or a terrorist.
Yes, you fucking are saying that! Look, most of the time I take people at their word, and I rarely attribute to malice what can more easily be explained by stupidity. But I mean, those are the only two options here. Either you're insulting my intelligence by deliberately lying to me that you're totally not saying that thing you're saying, or you genuinely are too stupid to realize that you are saying that developers aren't allowed to make games with playable Nazis or terrorists by your own standards, and you're insulting your own intelligence, lack thereof, or as I've posited, negative intelligence. Either way, I'm glad that just as you have no obligation to play games that trigger your delicate mind, game developers equally have no obligation to listen to your insane ramblings.
But what we are saying is that the fact that you're playing as a Nazi or a terrorist in a game has to mean something.
No, it fucking doesn't. It's just a fucking video game. We've been over this 1,000 times by now. Video games are not reality.
And it can't just be a skin. It can't be something that a game randomly drops you into.
Yes, it fucking can be. As I've said before, you don't have to buy the game, and even if you do, and playing as a Nazi or a terrorist in said game somehow takes you by surprise, you don't have to continue playing it either. If you're too much of a pussy to play games made for adults, you can instead play something that was made for your mental demographic, children.
And really, if we are saying anything in this episode, it's this. Games can do better.
Fuck you, you're not a gamer. I don't care if you spend every waking moment of your life playing video games, you are not a gamer. You know why I say that? Because a gamer would never say that games need to do better. A gamer would realize that games are already great and they continue to get better for one simple reason. That one simple reason can be described by many words, such as choice, freedom, variety, options, etc. But basically, there are a wide variety of video games out there, and as long as game developers have the creative freedom to design their games how they want to, and the consumers have the choice of what systems they want to play on, PC Master Race, and what games they want to play on said platforms, the system works. I'm not saying there aren't problems within the game industry, but the games themselves are not the problem. There are so many different options to choose from that it's frankly ridiculous to be complaining about a single game or a particular subgenre as though it's a societal issue. Because first of all, it's really not, and second of all, you can easily find several hundred games that literally have nothing to do with the thing that bothered you in the first place. So fuck off and go play them already.
And in this particular case, it's not even that hard to do better.
Fuck off. At this point, I have zero respect for you. You're the one who needs to do better, but I'm quite certain that's impossible because the mindless nonsense you spewed in this video could not possibly come from a rational person. It could only come from an ideologically brainwashed NPC drone.
And it's no more costly to do better.
It is when your sales numbers tank from pandering to the wrong crowd. I mean, the whole get woke, go broke thing may be a bit exaggerated at times, but it most certainly can be true at other times.
All it requires is that we in the game industry be cognizant of the world around us.
Do you even know what gaming is? It's literally all about building virtual worlds that, while at times they may resemble it, are not the real world around us. It's called escapism, specifically because many people who get into gaming do so because it offers a temporary escape from the real world.
And what these symbols we're drawing on mean.
Objectively, they mean nothing. It is only through subjective human perception that meaning is applied to symbols. I know I'm being pedantic again, but I think it's an important thing to remember when we're talking about symbols and logos and the like.
That we think as we're building, not just about the game we're working on, but about the world as a whole.
I honestly don't know if you have anything to do with actual game development, because I don't know nor frankly care who you are, but I will say that I sincerely hope that I never play a game that you had any influence in the creation of. I'd imagine you'd suck the fun out of everything you touch in the name of political correctness, or social justice, as you might call it.
If we can do that, we can take a big step forward for the industry.
No, censorship and political propaganda are not a big step forward for the gaming industry or for anything, ever.
We can stop helping to normalize Nazis.
I was going to say that the fact that you, or at least people who seem to share your political leanings, tend to call everyone they disagree with Nazis as a way to demonize them is evidence that Nazis are anything but normalized. But then it occurred to me, the prevalence of that label being thrown around by the morons on the left side of the pointlessly divided political false dichotomy at the morons on the right side of it is making the word Nazi something you hear literally every day. So if anything, that is what's normalizing Nazis, because it's lowering the standard of what counts as a Nazi from where it should be, in my opinion, describing fascistic war criminals acting on behalf of a hateful ideology during World War II, to simply anyone who is the least bit conservative or not liberal enough. Honestly, the inaccuracy of calling the modern left liberal could be its own video, but this one is already long enough, and I'm basically trying to wrap it up. For now, I'll just say that if you want my advice on how to stop helping to normalize Nazis, I would humbly suggest you stop throwing that word around so much in political arguments and reserve that label only for those who truly earn it by at the very least advocating for some kind of genocide. At least then, calling them that would make some sort of sense. But that's pretty much the end of the video. Like I said, I'm planning to move away from this kind of video in the future because the format is getting a bit stale and overplayed. But I just had to respond to that particular pile of steaming bullshit. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. If you didn't, you can give it a thumbs down. I really don't care. If you like my content in general, or if my plan for less political, more entertainment-based, on-camera and unscripted content interests you, please make sure you're subscribed and click the bell icon to get notifications whenever I upload a new video. Follow me on Twitter and BitChute. I spend way more time than I probably should on the former, and post my videos several hours early on the latter. If you really like my content and wish to support it financially, please consider doing so on Patreon. I know I should really try to get on Subscribestar one of these days, and I hear good things about it, but in the meantime, any amount you can spare would be greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time. Stay great, apes. If you really like my content and wish to support it financially, please consider